The day Charles Shelby saddled his horse and rode toward the amber glow of lantern lights spilling from the Dunn barn was the day everyone in Caldwell, Kansas stopped what they were doing and stared. It was the autumn of 1882, and the night air carried the particular sharpness that came when the plains began to surrender to October, that crisp edge that smelled of dried grass and wood smoke and something distant and unnamed. The Dunn Harvest Social was the biggest gathering of the season, always held on the third Saturday of October, and Mabel Dunn had been sending out invitations since the last week of September. She sent them to every household within 10 miles. She sent them to the blacksmith and the schoolteacher and the widow Carver who lived at the far edge of the creek road. She sent them to the Reverend and to old Percy Hatch who ran the feed store and to the 3 Crawford brothers who farmed the eastern acreage. She did not send one to Charles Shelby. She had not sent one last year, nor the year before that. In fact, Mabel Dunn, who was known for her thoroughness and her persistence, had stopped sending invitations to Charles Shelby exactly 4 years ago, after he had declined her 5th consecutive one with a note that was polite but firm and contained exactly 15 words. Mrs. Dunn, I appreciate your kindness, but I am afraid I must decline once again. The town had long since accepted it. Charles Shelby did not attend socials. He did not attend barn dances or church picnics or the 4th of July celebrations or the Christmas gathering at the school hall. He came to town when he needed supplies. He tipped his hat when spoken to. He paid his debts on time and asked nothing of anyone. And then he rode his gray horse back up the hill toward the property that had once been his father's and was now entirely his own, and he disappeared behind those hills like a man who had made peace with solitude and intended to keep it. 5 years. That was how long he had been turning people down. Which was why, when Hank Dunn looked up from the watering trough outside the barn and saw Charles Shelby riding down the lane at 7:30 in the evening, wearing a clean shirt and his good hat, he dropped the ladle he was holding and it clattered against the wood and bounced into the dirt. Lord above, Hank said to no one in particular. Inside the barn, Cora Winslow was helping Rebecca Marsh pin a loose string of dried corn husks back onto the beam above the refreshments table when someone grabbed her elbow with just enough urgency to make her nearly drop the tack she was holding. Cora, said 16-year-old Annie Dunn, who was Mabel's youngest and had been watching the lane from the door, you will not believe what I am looking at right now. If it is another raccoon in the corn bin, I am not the one to deal with it, Cora said, pressing the tack firmly into the beam. It is not a raccoon. It is Charles Shelby. Cora stepped down from the stool she had been standing on and turned around slowly, the way a person does when they are not entirely sure they heard correctly and they want to be certain before they commit to a reaction. Charles Shelby, Annie confirmed, her eyes enormous, on his gray horse, coming up the lane right now. Cora walked to the barn door. She was 26 years old, 5 feet and 4 inches of composed, practical Kansas woman, and she had grown up in this town alongside the legend of Charles Shelby, the way you grow up alongside the story of a storm that passed through before you were quite old enough to understand it, but everyone still talked about. She had been 19 when his wife Margaret died in childbirth, taking the baby with her. She had been 21 when she moved back to Caldwell from the 2 years she had spent in Wichita helping her aunt, and by then Charles Shelby had already retreated fully into his silence, his farm, his distance, and his reputation for being the most politely unreachable man in Ford County. She had spoken to him exactly 4 times in her life. Once when she was 12 and he was 16, and she had asked him to pass the salt at a church supper, and he had done so without speaking. Once when she was 22, and she had bumped into him at the mercantile and dropped her list on the floor, and he had picked it up and handed it back to her and said, "Pardon me, Miss Winslow." Once when she was 24 and she had been driving her wagon past his property line, and the wheel had broken on the rough track, and he had come out to the road without being asked, and helped her change it, and then walked back to his field without accepting her thanks. And once, 3 weeks ago, when she had been at the general store, and he had been there and their eyes had met over a display of tin goods, and something had passed between them that Cora had been doing her very best not to think about since. She looked out the barn door and she saw him. He was dismounting, his movements easy and unhurried, the way a tall man moves when he has long since made peace with his own body. He was 30 years old, she knew that. Dark-haired, broad-shouldered, with a jaw that might have been carved from the same limestone as the creek bluffs to the north of town. He wore a dark shirt she had never seen before, which meant it was probably new, and his hat was his good one, the one he sometimes wore into town on Fridays, and he was leading his horse to the post at the edge of the yard with the careful attention of a man who cared deeply about his animal. Hank Dunn was still standing there looking at him the way you look at something you expect to vanish if you blink. Cora stepped out of the barn. She told herself later that she had no particular reason to be the one to go out there. Mabel was inside fussing over the food. Hank was perfectly capable of greeting guests, but her feet had carried her forward before her head had finished the argument, and now she was standing in the yard in her good blue dress with the cream collar, 3 feet from Charles Shelby, who had just finished tying his horse to the post and had turned around and seen her. For a moment neither of them said anything. "Mr. Shelby," she said at last, and she was proud of herself because her voice came out steady and even and gave away nothing. "I do not believe Mabel sent you an invitation." He looked at her for a beat. His eyes were a particular shade of dark brown that in lamplight appeared almost black, and they were direct in the way that some men's eyes are direct, not unkindly but honestly, like he was not in the habit of pretending to look elsewhere. "No," he said. "She did not." Cora waited. "I know she did not," he added, and there was something in the way he said it that made her understand he was telling her something more than just the bare fact of the thing, though she could not immediately identify what it was. She tilted her head slightly. "Then what brings you here, if you do not mind my asking?" He looked toward the barn, toward the soft glow of the lanterns and the sound of fiddle music that had just started up inside, and then he looked back at her, and he said, "I suppose I got tired of staying home." It was not a romantic declaration. It was not the kind of thing a man says in a novel. It was simple and plain and slightly rough around the edges, and something about the plainness of it made Cora's heart do a thing she had not given it permission to do. "Well," she said, and she turned and gestured toward the barn door. "You had better come in, then." The reaction inside the Dunn barn when Charles Shelby walked through the door was something that Cora would remember for the rest of her life. It was not dramatic exactly. No one screamed or dropped anything significant, but there was a perceptible ripple that moved through the gathered crowd the way a stone moves water, a collective shift of attention that was brief and undisguised, and then smoothed itself back into normalcy, because these were Kansas people, and they were not given to gawking for long. Mabel Dunn appeared at Cora's elbow from nowhere. Mabel was 61 years old and built like a woman who had never once been startled by anything, but she was looking at Charles Shelby with an expression that suggested even her considerable reserves of composure were being tested. "Charles Shelby," she said. "Mrs. Dunn," he said, "I hope you will forgive me for arriving without an invitation." "I stopped sending you one 4 years ago," she said. "I know that," he said. "I stopped deserving one about that long ago." Mabel stared at him for a long moment, and then she did something no one had expected, which was that she patted his arm in the firm, no-nonsense way that was her specific version of warmth and said, "There is apple cider on the table and Hank made his vinegar pie. Go eat something." And just like that, Charles Shelby was at the Dunn Harvest Social. Cora did not spend the whole evening watching him. She danced twice with Tom Farley, who was a perfectly decent man and a terrible dancer, and she helped Mabel refill the cider jug twice, and she talked to Rebecca Marsh about the schoolhouse roof, which had been leaking since the spring and which the town council had been promising to fix since before summer. She laughed with Annie Dunn about the raccoon that had been terrorizing the Dunn corn supply. She was, by any reasonable measure occupied. But she was aware of him. The way you are aware of a fire in a room, not because you are watching it, but because you can feel the warmth of it shifting whenever you move. He stood near the edge of the gathering for the first hour. He drank cider and nodded to the men who came to speak to him, and answered their questions in the direct, brief way he had that was not rude, but was not expansive either. She noticed that he seemed more at ease than she might have expected. She had imagined, on the rare occasions she had allowed herself to imagine anything about Charles Shelby at all, that he would seem stiff and uncomfortable in a crowd after 5 years of avoiding them. But he did not seem uncomfortable. He seemed watchful, which was different. He was a man who had chosen to step back into the world and was paying attention to what the world was doing now that he was in it again. The fiddle player, who was old Gus Hendricks, struck up a slower tune around 9 o'clock, and Cora found herself standing near the refreshments table with Rebecca, who had just excused herself to find her husband. And suddenly Cora was standing alone with a cup of cider and nowhere particular to be, and before she could arrange herself otherwise, Charles Shelby was beside her. "You are the one who organized this," he said. It was not quite a question. Cora looked at him. "How do you know that?" "I asked Hank," he said, which was so straightforwardly honest that she almost laughed. "Mabel organizes the food," Cora said. "I helped with the decorations and the invitations this year. She asked me to take over some of it because her hip has been troubling her." "The invitations," he said. "Yes. You sent out all the invitations." "I did." He was quiet for a moment, turning his cider cup in his hands. "And you did not send one to me?" "No," Cora said. She held his gaze steadily because she was not a woman who looked away from things. "I heard it had become something of a tradition for you to decline. I did not want to add to the tradition." He looked at her and something shifted in his expression, something she could not name, but that made her pulse do a small, traitorous thing in her wrists. "Maybe that was the problem," he said. "Maybe I needed someone to stop inviting me." Cora blinked. "I beg your pardon. Maybe I needed to have the choice taken away," he said, "so that the only way to come was to decide to do it myself." She stared at him for a moment. The fiddle was playing something low and sweet, and the lanterns were casting everything in gold. Around them, people were dancing and talking and laughing and living their ordinary evening lives, and Cora Winslow was standing with Charles Shelby and trying very hard to understand what he was saying to her. "Did you come tonight because of me?" she asked. The directness of it surprised even her. He did not flinch from it. "I came tonight because I have not been living," he said, "and I figured it was probably time to start again." He paused. "But if you are asking whether you were part of what made me decide that tonight was the right time, then yes. I would not say you were nothing to do with it." The 3 weeks since they had looked at each other over the display of tin goods in the general store had apparently been doing more work than Cora had realized. "I see," she said, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Would you like to dance, Mr. Shelby? Since you are here and the fiddle is playing and there seems no point wasting the occasion." He set down his cider cup and held out his hand. He was not a polished dancer. He was not the kind of man who had spent his evenings practicing at socials. He moved with care rather than elegance, and he kept a proper and respectful distance, and he was clearly thinking about what his feet were doing with a degree of concentration that he was not entirely able to disguise. But he did not step on her feet, and his hand at her waist was steady and warm, and when he looked at her during the dance, he looked at her with that same direct honesty she was beginning to understand was just how he looked at everything. "You are concentrating very hard," she said after a few measures. "I have not danced in some time," he said. "I had gathered that." "Am I doing terribly?" "No," she said honestly. "You are doing just fine." He almost smiled. It was not quite a full smile. It was a slight softening at the corners of his mouth and a brief warming of his eyes that she suspected was as close as Charles Shelby got to smiling these days, and she thought that a man who had not smiled fully in 5 years was a man who deserved to have someone bring it back for him. The song ended and they stepped apart, and there was a moment that hung between them like something delicate and undecided. And then Mabel Dunn appeared and told Charles that Hank wanted to ask him about his drainage problem on the north field. And Charles excused himself with a look that said he was sorry for the interruption. And Cora watched him go and told herself firmly to be sensible. She was not entirely successful at this. The social wound down around 10:30, as all good Kansas socials did on a Saturday night, people needing to be up early for the livestock regardless of how much they were enjoying themselves. Cora helped Mabel wrap the leftover food and stack the chairs along the barn wall while the men moved the tables outside to be folded up. The fiddle player packed away his instrument. The children, who had been running between legs all evening, were gathered up by their parents and herded toward wagons. Cora was carrying a stack of tin plates toward the house when she heard the footstep behind her and turned to find Charles Shelby. "Let me take those," he said. She handed them over. They walked toward the house together in the cool dark, the air now entirely October, carrying that fine dry edge that the plains did so well. "Will you come to the Christmas social?" she asked. She was not sure where the question came from, except that she did not want to wait until the next time they stood in a general store looking at each other over dry goods. He considered the question with the seriousness he seemed to give to everything. "That depends," he said. "On what?" "On whether whoever is sending the invitations this year sends one to me or not." She stopped walking and turned to look at him in the dark. The light from the house windows reached them softly, and she could see the edges of his face, the set of his jaw, the quiet steadiness of his eyes. "Mr. Shelby," she said carefully, "if I send you an invitation to the Christmas social, are you going to come?" "Cora," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and something about hearing it in his voice was like a door opening in a house she had not known was closed. "If you send me an invitation, I will be there." She nodded once. "Then I will send you one." She took the plates from him, went inside, and did not look back, because she was quite sure that if she looked back she would have given away entirely too much. And she was a woman who liked to keep at least some of her cards close until she understood what game was being played. She thought about him all the way home in her wagon. She thought about him in her kitchen while she heated milk before bed. She was still thinking about him when she finally fell asleep, and her last waking thought was that 5 years was a very long time for a man to be alone, and that whatever had brought him out of that solitude deserved to be treated with great care. 3 weeks passed. The town of Caldwell watched with the rapt attention of people who had run out of more interesting things to observe. It was Tom Farley who first mentioned to Percy Hatch that he had seen Charles Shelby's gray horse tied outside the Winslow place on a Tuesday afternoon. Percy mentioned it to Mabel Dunn the following Friday. Mabel mentioned it to her daughter Clara, who told her husband, and by the following Sunday it was effectively common knowledge, subject to varying degrees of speculation and embellishment depending on who was doing the telling. The reality of it was considerably quieter than the speculation, which was exactly as Cora would have chosen it. Charles had stopped by on that Tuesday to return a pair of tools she had loaned him, tools that she had loaned him 3 days prior when she had driven past his property and seen him struggling with a section of fence, and had stopped and suggested he borrow her father's old post-hole diggers. This had been perhaps a slight overstepping of the social norms that said a woman did not stop uninvited at a man's property. But Cora had never been particularly hamstrung by those norms, and the fence genuinely needed fixing, and she genuinely had the tools, so she had loaned them. He had returned them on Tuesday and had stood in her doorway for perhaps 20 minutes talking about the fence, and about the unseasonably dry autumn, and about the state of the road between his property and town, which had developed a particularly terrible rut near the old cottonwood that had been there since before either of them could remember. And then he had thanked her and put his hat back on and gone to his horse, and she had watched him ride away and thought, somewhat helplessly, that 20 minutes was not nearly enough. He came back on Thursday, not with any obvious errand this time. He had knocked on her door in the late afternoon, and when she opened it he had said, with the straightforward manner she was becoming fond of, "I thought I would come by, if that is all right." "It is all right," she had said, and she had made coffee, and they had sat at her kitchen table while the light changed outside her window and talked for 2 hours about everything and nothing. About her time in Wichita, which she described as educational in the way that living somewhere bigger than you expected can be educational, meaning you learn a great deal and are relieved to come home. About his childhood on the property, which had been his father's before him and his grandfather's before that, 3 generations of Shelbys on the same piece of Kansas. About the horses he kept. About her late father, who had been the county surveyor for 20 years before his heart gave out in the spring of 1879. About her mother, who was still living, having remarried a cattle rancher named Horace Ford and moved to Dodge City the previous year. About books, which surprised her, because she had not expected him to read much, but he had a shelf of them in his house that he mentioned with a casualness that suggested they were simply part of the furniture of his life. And then he had gone home as the dark came on, and Cora had sat alone in her kitchen with 2 empty coffee cups and had acknowledged to herself, with the pragmatic honesty that was part of her nature, that she was in very considerable danger of falling in love with Charles Shelby. This was not entirely convenient. She had a life that was well organized and self-sufficient. She ran the small house her father had left her, and did alterations and fine sewing for the women in town, work she was good at and took pride in. She had her friends and her routines and her independence, which she valued with the particular fierceness of a woman who had seen what happened when women organized themselves entirely around men, and then found themselves with nothing left when circumstances changed. She had been practical about the question of marriage. She had not been opposed to it in theory, but she had not been desperate for it either, and she had turned down 2 offers in the past 3 years from perfectly decent men who had simply failed to be compelling. Charles Shelby was compelling in a way she had not anticipated and could not entirely account for. He was not obviously charming. He was not the kind of man who dazzled a room or filled a conversation with wit and warmth. He was quiet and serious, and he chose his words with the care of someone who had learned, possibly the hard way, that words mattered. But when he looked at her, she felt seen in a way that was so specific and so complete that it was almost unsettling. The way you feel when someone hands you something you have needed for a long time, and you had not told them you needed it. She wrote his invitation to the Christmas social on the 1st of December, sitting at her kitchen table in the early morning with the frost on the window glass and the lamp burning low, and she wrote it more carefully than she had written any of the others, and she told herself it was because her handwriting was important and first impressions mattered, and she did not examine that reasoning very closely. He received it on December 3rd. He showed up on December 4th to tell her so. She was in her front yard spreading feed for the 2 chickens she kept when she heard the hoofbeats and looked up, and there he was, riding down the lane with his breath making small clouds in the cold air, and she straightened up and shaded her eyes against the winter morning light. He dismounted and came to the fence and held up the envelope she had sent. "I got your invitation," he said. "I see that," she said. "I will be there," he said. She looked at him. He had ridden from his property, which was 3 miles north of town, in the December cold, specifically to tell her he would be attending the Christmas social. He could have sent word with anyone heading into Caldwell. He could have told her the next time he happened to see her. He had not. He had saddled his horse in the frost and ridden down. "Charles," she said, using his given name for the first time, and she watched the slight change in his expression when she did. "You could have sent a note." "I could have," he agreed. She waited. "I wanted to tell you myself," he said simply. The 2 chickens pecked around her feet obliviously. The frost was bright on the dead grass. The sky was that particular deep winter blue that only happens on cold, clear days, the kind of blue that seems almost artificial in its intensity. "There is coffee on," Cora said, "if you want to come in." He tied his horse to the fence post and came in, and they had coffee, and he stayed for 3 hours. And when he left, he paused in the doorway and looked at her with that quiet, serious attention of his and said, "I am glad I came to the Didnt social." "So am I," she said. He nodded, put his hat on, and went to his horse. She closed the door and leaned against it and pressed her hands flat against the wood and breathed for a moment, and then she went back to her kitchen and smiled at the wall. The Christmas social was held at the school hall on the 17th of December. Because it was always at the school hall, because the school hall was the biggest interior space in Caldwell aside from the Didnt barn. And in December the Didnt barn was not a comfortable prospect. Cora arrived early to help set up, as she always did, bringing her contribution of molasses cookies and a dried apple cake that she had spent the better part of Friday afternoon making, which was longer than she usually spent on a cake, and she did not examine that either. The hall was bright and warm, decorated with pine boughs that the Crawford boys had brought in from the stand of trees to the west, and there was a big pot of cider mulling on the stove in the corner. The town's ladies had outdone themselves on the food table, as they always did for Christmas, and old Gus Hendricks had brought 2 other musicians, so that there would be a full trio of fiddle, banjo, and harmonica. Charles arrived at 7:15. She knew the moment he walked in because she was talking to Rebecca Marsh, and she felt the shift in the room, that same small ripple that had gone through the Didnt barn, though this time smaller because the town had already had nearly 2 months to adjust to the idea of Charles Shelby reappearing in their social lives. He found her within 5 minutes. She thought this was a good sign. "You did the decorations again," he said when he reached her. "Some of them," she said. "Mrs. Carver did the boughs above the windows. I did the table." He looked at the table and then back at her. "You made the cake." She felt warmth move up the back of her neck and told herself it was the stove. "How do you know it was mine?" "You had dried apples on your table last time I was at your house," he said, "and I know it is your style, neat edges." She stared at him. He said it so simply, as if memorizing the details of her kitchen and her habits were entirely natural and unremarkable. "You noticed that." "I notice things," he said. She gave him a piece of the cake and watched him eat it standing there, and he told her it was very good with the particular earnestness of a man who was not practiced at compliments but meant the ones he gave, and she thought she might be entirely lost. They danced twice that evening, and the second time he was better at it than the first time, which she mentioned, and he said he had been practicing, and when she asked with whom, he said by himself in his kitchen, which made her laugh, a genuine full laugh that she had not expected from herself, and it clearly surprised him too, because he looked at her with a warmth she had not seen in his face before and then looked away, and she thought, with a certainty that was new and solid and arrived without warning, that she wanted to make him look at her like that as many times as she could. After the social, he walked her to her wagon. The night was cold and brilliant, the stars enormous in the way they are in Kansas in December, scattered across the black sky with what always feels like excessive generosity. They stood beside her wagon, and she was aware that something was at a decision point, that they had been moving carefully toward something for 2 months, and that carefully was the right pace, but that it was also possibly time for more than carefully. "Cora," he said. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He had his hat in his hands, turning it in a gesture she had not seen him do before, the only sign that he was not entirely composed. "I want to be honest with you," he said, "because I think that is more important than being smooth about it." "I appreciate honesty," she said. He looked at her. "I have not been much company for the past 5 years. I know that. I made choices about how I was going to live that I am not entirely proud of, not because grieving was wrong, but because I let it close me off from things that I should not have let it close me off from." He paused. "I am not sure I know how to do this in the way a man is supposed to. I have been a long time not doing it." She looked at him steadily. "What is it that you are trying to do?" He held her gaze. "I would like to court you," he said, "if you are willing." "Properly? with the intention of seeing whether we might be suited for something permanent, because I am not interested in things that are not serious, and I do not think you are either. The stars were very bright. The cold air was perfectly still. Somewhere on the other side of the school hall someone was laughing and a horse was stamping its feet in the cold. "No," she said, "I am not interested in things that are not serious." "Then can I court you?" "You may court me," she said. He put his hat back on. And then he did something she had not expected, which was that he reached out and took her gloved hand and held it for a moment, just briefly, just her hand in both of his, and looked at her with everything showing in his face that he usually kept so carefully contained, and it was the most quietly devastating thing anyone had ever done to her. "Thank you," he said. He helped her up onto the wagon seat and stepped back, and she drove home through the December dark with the stars wheeling above her and her hand still warm inside her glove where he had held it. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was a courtship conducted in the particular rhythm of the frontier, which was to say it was interwoven with the practical business of living, because life on the plains did not pause for romance. Charles rode to her house. She drove to his. They sat in kitchens and on cold porch steps wrapped in quilts when the day was clear enough, and they talked the way she had rarely talked to another person, with the easy depth of two people who had been waiting without knowing it to find someone who matched the pace of their thinking. She learned things about him in those months. She learned that he woke before dawn every day, not because he needed to, but because he had never been able to sleep past it. She learned that he had taught himself to cook after Margaret died because the alternative was eating badly indefinitely, and that he had become, with the same careful persistence he brought to everything, a genuinely competent cook. She learned that he had a dry sense of humor that was so quiet you could miss it if you were not paying close attention, and that he had spent a considerable amount of the past 5 years regretting the way he had buried himself in that silence, not because the grief was not real, but because grief was not supposed to be the permanent shape of a life. She told him things in return. She told him about her father, who had been a gentle and methodical man who had taught her to survey land and to read maps, and to understand that geography mattered, that where you were had a great deal to do with who you could be. She told him about Wichita, which she had liked in some ways and found overwhelming in others, that particular feeling of a city growing faster than it could organize itself. She told him about the 2 proposals she had turned down and why, because they were from decent men who wanted her to be smaller than she was, not cruelly but as a natural assumption, and she had not been able to make herself be smaller. He had listened to that last part with careful attention. "I do not think you are small," he said. "I know that," she said. "That is part of why I am sitting here with you." January brought snow and February brought more of it, the big quiet kind that sat on the plains for weeks, and during those weeks Charles came every few days without fail, riding through the snow with the patience of a man who did not make excuses to himself for the things he wanted. He helped her when the water pump froze and needed thawing. She helped him when one of his mares came down with a respiratory ailment and needed care around the clock for 3 days. On those 3 nights she stayed at the property, sleeping in the small spare room with his horse blankets and waking before dawn to help with the mare. And on the morning of the 3rd day, when the mare finally steadied and ate properly, and Charles stood in the stall with his forehead resting against the horse's neck in plain relief, Cora watched him from the stall door and felt a love so complete and so certain that it was more like recognition than revelation. The way you feel when you find something you have been looking for so long you had stopped thinking of yourself as looking. He straightened up and turned around, and she was still standing in the doorway watching him, and he looked at her. "She is going to be all right," he said. "She is going to be all right," she agreed. He came to her and stopped in front of her and looked at her with everything unguarded in the way that was uniquely him, and he said, "Cora, I think you already know what I want to say." "I think I do," she said. "I'm going to say it anyway," he said. "Go ahead." "I love you," he said. I have been working up the nerve to say that for a month. It did not seem like the kind of thing to rush, but I also did not want to wait so long that you thought I did not mean it." She put her hand against his face, and he covered it with his, and she felt the calluses on his palm and the warmth of his skin and the solidity of him. "I love you too," she said. "I have for a while." He kissed her then, in the stable doorway with the recovered mare watching them placidly, and the winter light coming through the high window, and it was unhurried and entirely certain, the kiss of two people who knew what they were doing and intended to keep doing it. The spring arrived with the particular ferocity of Kansas springs, sudden and dramatic and entirely indifferent to human schedules, and Charles Shelby rode into Caldwell on a bright April morning and went first to the general store, where he bought a length of good ribbon without explaining why to the storekeeper's obvious curiosity, and then he went to Cora Winslow's house and knocked on the door. She opened it with flour on her hands and her hair not quite as tidy as usual, and she looked at him and said, "You are here early." "I have something to ask you," he said. She looked at him more carefully. He had his good hat on and his clean shirt, the dark one from the harvest social, and he was holding a piece of ribbon in a way that suggested it was serving as a stand-in for something else entirely, because he had not thought quite far enough ahead to buy a ring. "Come in," she said, and she dried her hands and turned around, and he was standing in her kitchen with the ribbon and the good hat and the expression of a man who has made the most important decision of his life and is entirely at peace with it. "Cora Winslow," he said, "I have spent 5 years of my life shut away from the world, and I do not want to spend any more time shut away from you. I am asking you to marry me. I know I am not the easiest man, and I know my house needs work, and I know I have not always been present in the way a man ought to be in this town, but I am asking you to trust that I am coming back to myself and that you are a considerable part of why. Will you marry me?" She stood in her kitchen with the April light coming through the window and looked at him for a long, unhurried moment. "I want a ring," she said, "not the ribbon." He almost smiled. "I know, I was going to get one. I just did not want to walk into a jeweler before I knew what I was walking in for. Say yes first and then go buy the ring. Something like that." She crossed the kitchen to him and put both hands on the front of his shirt and looked up at him. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, Charles Shelby, and yes, you need to get a proper ring." He found one at the jeweler in Wichita the following weekend, a simple gold band with a small garnet set in it, because he had asked Cora's friend Rebecca what she might like, and Rebecca had told him Cora preferred things that were simple and genuine over things that were showy, and he had gone with that. And when he put it on her finger on the evening, he returned it fit her well enough, and she looked at it the way a person looks at something that belongs to them. They were married on the 15th of June, 1883, in the same school hall where they had danced at the Christmas social, by Reverend Pierce, who had known both of them since they were children, and who performed the ceremony with the kind of warmth that comes from genuinely meaning the words you are saying. The whole town came. Mabel Dunn sat in the front row and cried in a dignified way that involved one handkerchief and no audible sound. Old Percy Hatch wore his Sunday suit and shook Charles's hand for so long that Charles eventually had to extract himself. Tom Farley, who had danced twice with Cora at the harvest social and had therefore been the last man to do so before Charles staked his claim, offered his congratulations with good grace and only minor evidence of regret. Rebecca Marsh was Cora's attendant, standing beside her in a blue dress and holding her small bouquet of wild prairie flowers. Charles stood at the front of the school hall and watched Cora walk toward him in a dress she had made herself, cream-colored with small blue flowers worked along the collar and cuffs, and his face was the most entirely open she had ever seen it, all his quiet reserve set aside for the occasion, and what was there instead was something so plainly full of love that Rebecca, who was watching his face, had to look away and compose herself. The Reverend asked the words. They said the words back. Charles put the ring on her finger with the particular care he brought to important things, and when the Reverend said he could kiss the bride, he did so in a way that was brief and proper for the occasion and entirely full of everything it meant, and Cora heard Mabel Dunn's dignified cry become briefly less dignified, and she thought that was exactly right. The reception was in the yard of the school, because June permitted it, with tables set outside and Gus Hendricks and his musicians in the corner of the yard playing all evening. There was more food than anyone could eat, because when the women of Caldwell decided to contribute to something they did so with intensity, and the long tables were covered with pies and breads and salted meats and enough cake to feed the county. Charles danced with her 3 times, and he was better at it than he had been at the harvest social. And when she told him so, he said that he had kept practicing in his kitchen. And she laughed, and he looked at her with that warmth she had been cataloging since December. And she thought she could spend the whole rest of her life collecting those looks. At the end of the evening, when the guests had gone and the tables had been cleared, and the June dark had settled over Caldwell with its warm smell of grass and summer, they rode together in her wagon toward the Shelby property, which was now her property too. The sky was enormous above them in the way that plain skies always are, full of stars too numerous to count, and the night air was warm and full of cricket sound. "I never thought I would be here," he said quietly, not sadly, just honestly. "Where?" she asked. "In this wagon. In this life," he said, "back in it, happy in it." She took his hand on the wagon seat. "You are back in it." "I am," he said. "I will not leave it again." She believed him. The years that followed were the kind of years that do not make for dramatic stories but make for deeply good lives, which is to say they were full of the layered, ordinary richness that comes from 2 people who choose each other deliberately and continuously, and build something together that is more substantial than either of them would have managed alone. Charles's property, which had been efficiently maintained but somewhat spare during his years of solitude, began to change. Not dramatically and not all at once, but with the gradual accumulation of a life shared. Cora brought her things from her father's house, and they found places for them, her shelves of sewing notions and her good china, and the 2 framed maps her father had made that went on the wall of the front room. Her chickens came. A kitchen garden that had been primarily practical became also something beautiful, because she had a way with growing things that he did not, and was happy to cede to her. He built onto the house in the autumn of 1883, adding a proper workroom for her sewing because the kitchen was not enough space, and he was precise about it in the way he was precise about everything, and the room came out even and well made, and she set up her sewing table in it with the south window full of light, and spent long mornings working in it while he was in the fields. And in the afternoon, when he came in for his midday meal, they sat together in the kitchen and talked about the day. The sewing work was something she had continued after the marriage, because she was good at it, and it brought in a modest additional income, and she had no intention of giving up something she did well simply because she no longer strictly needed the money. Charles had not suggested she should, which continued to be one of the things she loved best about him. He treated her work with the same respect he treated his own. In the spring of 1884, she told him she was expecting. She told him on a Tuesday morning at the kitchen table over coffee, directly and without elaborate preamble, because that was how she did everything. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he reached across the table and took her hand, and she saw something move through his face that was very close to the emotion he had been carrying for years, all those years of the child he had lost with Margaret, and she held his hand and let him have the moment. "Are you all right?" she asked, because she wanted to be sure. "I am very all right," he said. "I am better than all right. Are you frightened?" She asked because she knew him well enough by then to know that he held fear quietly. He looked at her. "Yes," he said honestly, "but not in a way that is bigger than I can manage." "Good," she said, "because I may need you to manage it." He squeezed her hand and did not let go for a long time. Their son was born in November of 1884, a strong and loud arrival that Cora managed with the determination she brought to everything, with Rebecca Marsh and the town midwife, Mrs. Aldis, in attendance. And when Charles was finally allowed in, and Cora placed the baby in his arms, he held the boy with the careful, terrified tenderness of a man who is holding the most important thing he has ever been handed. "He is perfect," Charles said, and his voice was not entirely steady. "He is," Cora agreed from the bed, watching him. They named him James, after Cora's father, and Charles agreed to this with the particular warmth of a man who understood what was being offered. James Robert Shelby, born on a cold November morning in 1884, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's tendency to observe everything with great seriousness before deciding what to do about it. The town of Caldwell, for its part, received the news of James's arrival with the pleasure that small towns take in new babies, which is to say enthusiastically, and with considerable food delivered. Mabel Dunn brought 2 pies. Rebecca Marsh brought a quilted blanket she had been making in secret since summer. Old Percy Hatch came to the door with an awkward but sincere congratulations and a jar of his wife's preserved plums. Even old Gus Hendricks stopped by to declare the baby a fine specimen. Charles stood on the porch of his house on a crisp November afternoon while Cora was inside resting, and the baby was sleeping, and the visitors had temporarily dispersed. And he looked out at the fields that were his and the sky that was enormous and the brown winter grass that would be green again in spring. And he thought about the harvest social on a night 2 years ago when he had saddled his horse and ridden toward the light of the Dunn barn for no reason he could have fully articulated, except that 5 years was too long and something needed to change. He thought about Cora standing in the yard in her blue dress with the cream collar telling him she had not sent him an invitation because she did not want to add to the tradition, and the way she had held his gaze without flinching when she said it. He thought about how different his life was now from the life he had been living, and he thought that the difference was so complete and so fundamental that it felt almost like the difference between sleeping and being awake. He went back inside to his wife and his son. The years continued to make themselves. 1885 brought a difficult summer, drought-dry and demanding, and Charles worked the farm with the focused endurance of a man who knew the land and respected it. And Cora managed the household and her sewing work, and the kitchen garden with the water carefully rationed. And they came through the summer tired but intact. And in the autumn when the rains finally came back, they stood on the porch together and watched the sky open up, and it felt like something more than weather. In 1886, there was a matter with the land that needed resolving, a dispute with a neighboring property owner named Harold Vance, who claimed that the eastern fence line of the Shelby land was 3 chains further east than Charles maintained, which would have put a portion of Charles's best grazing acreage in Vance's claim. It was the kind of dispute that could become very ugly very quickly in 1880s Kansas, where men had been known to resolve property disagreements in ways that the law viewed with varying degrees of urgency. Charles handled it the way he handled most things, with patient precision, digging up his grandfather's original survey documentation and cross-referencing it with the county records, and bringing Cora into it because she knew more about survey work than anyone in the county thanks to her father's teaching. And together they built a case that was so well documented and so clearly demonstrated that, when it went before the county judge in Wichita, the matter was resolved in 2 hours, and Harold Vance went home with his claim denied. On the drive home from Wichita, Charles said, "Your father's teaching saved us about 40 acres. "My father was a very thorough man," Cora said. "I am grateful for it." "So am I," she said, "in more ways than one. He taught me to read the land carefully before you make decisions about it. I think that applies to more than surveying." Charles looked at her. "Are you comparing the land dispute to courting?" "I am comparing careful observation to most good decisions," she said, and he smiled, the kind that had been coming more easily with every year that passed, and she still felt that particular satisfaction every time she saw it. The town of Caldwell continued to grow and change around them, as towns did in that era, the railroad that had come through in the 1870s bringing more settlers and more commerce and more disruption. There were years when the cattle drives that had made Caldwell famous were still a significant presence. The longhorn herds coming up from Texas along the Kisham Trail, the cowboys arriving with the particular energy of men who had been on the trail for months and were looking for a week of civilization. The cowboys were a complicated presence in Caldwell, as they had always been. They brought money, but they brought trouble too, and the town's relationship with the cattle trade had always been an uneasy balance. Charles had always stayed clear of the saloon side of it, preferring to sell his hay and grain to the drovers passing through and leave the rest of it to others. Cora had views about it that she did not hesitate to share, particularly as a member of the small group of women who advocated for the town school and its library and its general civility. And she had been known to say directly to the mayor that the revenue from the cattle trade was being used to patch over problems that the cattle trade itself was creating, which the mayor always received with the resigned expression of a man who knew she was right but could not afford to agree. In the late summer of 1887, a young cowboy named Eli Watts came into the Caldwell area with a herd and then stayed after the herd moved on, which was unusual enough to be noticed. He was about 20 years old, rangy and sun-darkened, and quiet in the specific way of young men who have learned quietness not from contentment but from guardedness, and he showed up at Charles's farm looking for work with a directness that Charles recognized and respected. Charles hired him for the harvest season, which was reasonable and practical and cost-efficient, and Eli turned out to be a genuinely good worker with a particular gift for the horses that Charles noticed and valued. By the end of the harvest season, it had become natural to ask him to stay on through the winter, and by the end of the winter, it had become clear that Eli was not going back on the trail, and Charles offered him a permanent position and a small wage and use of the little room off the barn, and Eli accepted with the brief gratitude of someone who was very relieved but not going to show it extensively. Cora had watched this process with the quiet attention she brought to people. She noticed that Eli ate too fast, the way people eat when they have sometimes not known when the next meal was coming. She noticed that he kept his few belongings in a very small space, as if he expected to have to pack them up quickly. She noticed that he was watchful around men who raised their voices and careful around crowds. She did not make a point of it. She simply made sure there was always enough food, and that his place at the table when he ate with them was as unremarked upon as any other chair, and she treated him with the matter-of-fact kindness that was her specific way of communicating that he was welcome without embarrassing him with the explicit statement of it. He called her Mrs. Shelby, and he called Charles Mr. Shelby, and he was endlessly patient and gentle with James, who was 3 years old by then, and developing the forceful personality that would characterize him all his life. Eli was good with the boy, serious and honest and not condescending, which James responded to the way children respond to adults who treat them with genuine respect. The autumn of 1887 brought the Caldwell Harvest Social again, and this year Cora organized the invitations entirely on her own because Mabel Dunn's hip had finally given her enough trouble that she was ceding some responsibilities, and Cora did it with her usual thoroughness. She wrote an invitation for Eli Watts without overthinking it, because he was part of the Shelby household and it would have been strange not to. She delivered it to him personally in the barn where he was finishing up the evening feed, and he looked at it in his hands for a moment. "I am not much for socials," he said, in a way that reminded her so strongly of a different person 5 years ago that she had to school her expression. "You do not have to go," she said, "but you are welcome." He went. He stood on the edges of it for most of the evening, like a man who was relearning the habit of people. And by the end of the night, he had talked to several of the Crawford brothers about horses and had eaten 3 pieces of Mabel's vinegar pie, and had been seen in what appeared to be a genuine conversation with Annie Dunn, who was now 21 years old and had grown into a bright and capable young woman who worked at the mercantile and was, by general consensus, too quick and interesting for most of the men in Caldwell to keep up with. Cora noticed this. Charles noticed that Cora noticed, and when they were driving home he said, "Let it alone." "I am not doing anything," she said. "You are planning something," he said. "I am simply observing that two young people with similar temperaments found something to talk about." "Cora, I am leaving it entirely alone," she said, and she mostly did, because she was wise enough to know that the best thing you can do for two careful, guarded people is give them space and proximity and let the rest happen on its own. It happened on its own over the following year, gradually and cautiously, the way things happen between people who have both learned to be careful with themselves. Annie came out to the Shelby farm on various pretexts that Cora accepted without comment, and Eli found reasons to come into town slightly more often than he strictly needed to. And by the spring of 1888, it was clear to everyone who was paying attention that something was developing, though both of them seemed to feel the need to be absolutely certain before they made anything public of it. Cora told Charles one evening that she thought Eli was going to ask Annie Dunn to walk with him. "Good," Charles said. "You knew." "I have known since October," he said. "You did not say anything." "You told me to leave it alone," he said. And there was that quiet, dry humor, and she put her elbow into his ribs gently, and he caught her hand and held it against his side. And they sat together on the porch in the spring evening, and the light was gold, and the prairie was greening up after the winter, and James was asleep inside, and the world was in its right order. Eli did ask Annie to walk with him, and Annie said yes, and Mabel Dunn received this news with an expression that took some time to sort itself out before settling on approval, because she had not entirely anticipated a traveling cowboy for a son-in-law prospect, but she was a practical woman, and she could see that Eli Watts was a good man who was becoming better, and that was more than could be said for some. By the summer of 1889, Eli and Annie were married in a small ceremony at the Dunn farm, with Cora making Annie's dress as her wedding gift and Charles standing beside Eli as his witness, because there was no one else Eli trusted enough to ask. And the day was warm, and the grass was green, and Mabel Dunn cried, with considerably less restraint than she had at any previous occasion. In 1889, Cora told Charles she was expecting again. He was in the barn checking on a new foal when she came to tell him, and he stood up and looked at her, and the warmth in his face was complete and unhesitating and entirely without the complicated shadow that had been present the first time, because they had done this before now, and he knew what they were capable of, what she was capable of, and his confidence in her was deep and steady. "James is going to be outraged," he said. "James is going to be outraged," she agreed. "He has been the only child for 5 years, and he has arranged the world accordingly. We will manage him. We will," she said. Their daughter arrived in February of 1890, in the coldest part of winter, a cold that was so complete it silenced even the wind, and she came into the world with considerably more patience than her brother had, but with a similar directness, looking at things with her dark eyes as if she were taking inventory. They named her Frances, after no one in particular except that it suited her, and James received her with the resigned dignity of a 5-year-old who has understood that some things cannot be argued with and has therefore decided to be magnanimous. He was, in fact, remarkably good with her. He would sit beside her basket and report to her on what was happening in the world, cattle drives and weather patterns and the state of the north fence, with a seriousness that made Cora press her face into Charles's shoulder to hide her expression. "He is going to be a good brother," Charles said. "He is practicing being the family authority," Cora said. "He is going to be insufferable." "He is going to be fine," Charles said, and he was right. The 1890s arrived with change, as decades tend to do. The great cattle drives were winding down as the railroads extended further into Texas, and made the long drives up to Kansas increasingly unnecessary, and Caldwell was adapting, as towns do, finding new economic identities, and the homesteaders were filling in the land that had previously been open range, and there were tensions that came with that, old conflicts between range culture and farming culture that Cora had views about and expressed them when she felt it was necessary. She continued to advocate, as she had throughout her adult life, for things she believed the community needed. She had been part of the group that pushed for the expansion of the school library. She was on the committee that organized the petition for a proper road repair after the county continued to ignore the condition of the western track. She wrote a letter to the county commissioner in 1891 that was so precisely argued and so completely documented that Percy Hatch read it in the general store and declared she should have been a lawyer, which she received as the compliment it was intended to be. Charles read everything she wrote. He was her first reader always, because she trusted his judgment and he gave it honestly and without softening it unnecessarily. And she appreciated the honesty more than she would have appreciated praise that wasn't earned. In the evenings of those years, they had a particular habit. After the children were in bed, after the day's work was finished and the house was quiet, they would sit together in the front room, Charles with whatever he was reading and Cora with her sewing or her writing. And there was a quality to those evenings that she thought about sometimes when she tried to articulate what she meant by happiness. It was not dramatic. It was not the rush of the early months of their relationship, the newness of discovering each other. It was something quieter and more durable, a companionship so complete that the room felt different when the other one was not in it. He still had the quality she had first noticed across the Dunn barn, that watchful attentiveness, the sense that he was paying close and genuine attention to the people and the world around him. It had not diminished with years. If anything, it had deepened, become more purposeful, because he had more to pay attention to. He watched his children with the focused love of a man who had learned not to take the ordinary daily presence of people for granted. And he watched Cora with the particular attention of a man who had understood early that she was more interesting than he would ever fully exhaust. She caught him watching her sometimes in the middle of ordinary things, washing dishes or reading or talking to James about his schoolwork, and she would look up and find his eyes on her, and there would be that warmth in his face, unchanged and undiminished, and she thought every time that this, specifically this, was what she had been hoping for when she had been 22 and practical about marriage, and not desperate but quietly hoping. James grew up with the seriousness and competence of a boy who had been raised to pay attention to things. He was 8, 9, 10, spending his days between school and the farm with an earnestness about both that made his parents exchange glances above his head sometimes. He had his father's patience and his mother's directness, and he was already, at 10, noticeably thoughtful in the way that suggested the combination was going to make him formidable when he was grown. Frances grew up to be someone else entirely, which was the surprise and delight of the household. Where James was serious, she was quick and mercurial. Where James planned, she improvised. She had Cora's dark eyes and Charles's dark hair and a laugh that seemed too large for her small person, and that she deployed without embarrassment. And she charmed everyone she met with a complete lack of self-consciousness that made Cora sometimes wonder how two careful and private people had produced this entirely open and exuberant person. She got it from somewhere, Charles said one evening after Frances had laughed so loudly at the supper table that one of the barn cats had looked up in alarm. "I think she got it from what we could not express," Cora said, "the parts we kept inside." He considered this. "That is a generous reading. I think it is the true one," she said. Eli and Annie Watts lived on a small property 1.5 miles from the Shelby farm, which Eli had purchased in 1890 after 3 years of saving his wages, and they had a son named Thomas born in 1891, and a daughter named Ruth born in 1893, and the two families were woven into each other's lives in the way that the best kinds of community connection is, not obligatory but genuinely chosen, present at significant moments, and available in ordinary ones. Annie had become one of Cora's closest friends, and this had surprised both of them a little because they were different in temperament. Annie being more immediately warm and expressive than Cora. But they had a mutual respect that was the foundation of the friendship and a shared humor that had emerged over years of knowing each other well. They met on Tuesday afternoons most weeks when weather permitted, sometimes at Cora's house and sometimes at Annie's, with the children running in the yard and the coffee pot kept full, and the conversation going in all the directions that good friendship allows. Mabel Dunn passed away in the winter of 1892. She had been failing gently for a year, her hip and then her heart, and she died in her own bed with Hank beside her and Annie and her other children around her. And it was the kind of death that is not tragic exactly, but is deeply sad in the way that losing someone who has been a fixed point of your world is sad. The way a landmark disappearing from the horizon makes the view feel less navigable. Cora wept, which she did not do often, and Charles held her and did not try to put useful words around it, which was exactly right. He had learned, in the years they had been together, that Cora did not want consolation that resolved her grief too quickly. She wanted to be allowed to feel it fully, and he gave her that, steady and present without being intrusive. The harvest social that following October was held in Mabel's honor as much as for the harvest, and Cora organized it and wept only once, privately, in the kitchen of the Dunn house while she was helping set up, and then composed herself and came out, and did everything with the thoroughness that Mabel would have demanded. Hank Dunn said to Charles that evening, standing at the edge of the yard watching the lantern-lit gathering, "Mabel always liked your wife, you know, right from the beginning." "I know," Charles said. "Mabel did not like everyone," Hank said. "She was selective." "She had good judgment," Charles said. "She thought you were an idiot for 5 years," Hank said mildly. Charles almost smiled. "She was right about that, too." The years continued. 1893 and 1894 brought the economic depression that gripped much of the country, a contraction that reached even into the Kansas plains and made the margins tighter and the calculations harder. Charles had managed the farm conservatively enough that they came through it without losing the land, though there were 2 years when it was closer than comfortable, and Cora's sewing income was not a small contribution to keeping them on the right side of the ledger. They talked about it honestly, as they talked about everything, at the kitchen table with the accounts spread between them, and there was no pretending it was fine when it was not, and there was no panic either, because they had each other's full attention and full effort, and that was what you worked with when things were difficult. James, who was 11 and 12 through those hard years, understood more than his parents might have liked, because he was the kind of child who listened closely to adult conversations and processed them seriously. He came to his father one evening with a proposal to expand the kitchen garden to sell more produce at the Caldwell market, and the proposal was detailed enough that Charles took it seriously, and they implemented a version of it, and James had the satisfaction of watching his idea make a modest difference, which was the kind of experience that shapes the character of a boy who is going to grow up to be capable. Francis, who was 4 and 5 in those years, was entirely undisturbed by the economic difficulty, except in the specific way of a small child, who occasionally has to be told that something is not available, and does not understand why, but accepts it with the resilience that well-loved children possess. By 1895 things had eased enough that Charles built a new horse shed and paid for it outright, and felt the satisfaction of a man who has come through difficulty intact. He came inside to tell Cora when the last nail was in and she was at her sewing table, and she looked up and he said, "It is done." And she understood everything he meant by those 2 words, and she rose and went to him, and they stood together in the workroom doorway. "We did well," she said. "We did," he said. "The late 1890s were good years, the kind that accumulate quietly and feel abundant." James, at 13 and 14, was developing the rangy height of his father and the focused intelligence that was his own, and he had begun working the land with the seriousness of a young man who understood it was going to be his eventually, and intended to learn it completely. He had also begun reading everything he could get his hands on, because Cora had raised him in a house with books, and the instinct had taken, and she drove him to Wichita twice a year to get books from the larger bookseller there, trips that James treated with a reverence that was entirely genuine. Frances, at 6 and 7, was in school, and was the delight and the occasional mild terror of her teacher, a young woman named Miss Hollies, who had been brave enough to tell Cora at the parents' gathering that Frances was the brightest child in the class and also the most difficult to contain, which Cora had received with the expression of a woman who was not surprised and was attempting not to visibly glow. On a June evening in 1897, when the air was warm and full of grass smell, and the light was that particular long prairie gold of summer, Cora and Charles sat on the porch after supper, as they did in summer evenings when the day allowed it. James was inside with a book. Frances was in the yard catching fireflies in a jar that she had been told she must release before bed. The farm was quiet around them, and the prairie stretched out to the darkening horizon, and the first stars were appearing in the east. Cora put her head on Charles's shoulder, which was something she did in quiet moments, and he put his arm around her, which was how he received it, and they watched Frances chase fireflies in the blue dusk. "Do you remember what you said to me the first night I ever really talked to you?" Cora asked. "Which part?" "You said you supposed you had gotten tired of staying home." He was quiet for a moment. "I remember." "It was the most important sentence you ever said to me," she said. "At the time I did not know that." "I did not know it either," he said. "I just knew I was tired. Of being alone. Of being absent," he said. "There is a difference. Being alone is a circumstance. Being absent is a choice. I had been choosing it for a long time." She lifted her head and looked at him. He was 45 years old, with gray at his temples now and lines at the corners of his eyes that had come from years of squinting against the Kansas sun, and he was the most familiar face in her world, and she still felt, looking at him, that particular thing that she had felt standing in the Dunn barn doorway on a harvest social night watching him tie his horse to the post. "I am glad you stopped choosing it," she said. "I am glad you did not send me an invitation," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "That is a strange thing to be glad about." "No, it is not," he said. "If you had sent me one I would have declined it, same as I always did. I had the habit of declining. You took away the invitation and made me decide for myself, and the thing I decided was to come anyway, and that was the only real decision I had made in 5 years." He paused. "Everything after that was because of that one decision." She thought about it. It was true. She had not intended it as strategy. She had simply done the practical thing, which was to stop sending invitations to a man who had refused every one for years. But the outcome was what he described. She had left him with the choice and he had made it. "You are giving me too much credit," she said. "I am giving you the right amount," he said, "which is what I have always tried to do." She put her head back on his shoulder, and they watched Frances catch one more firefly and hold the jar up to the last of the light to see it glow. "I am going to insist she lets them go," Charles said. "Give her 5 more minutes," Cora said. They sat in the warm June evening until the full dark came, and the stars were all out, and Frances had released the fireflies as promised and was asleep inside, and James was still reading by lamplight, and the Shelby farm was quiet around them with the vast and patient prairie quiet that Cora had grown up inside, and that Charles had been born into, and that was as much a part of them as anything else. In the autumn of 1898, at the Caldwell Harvest Social that Cora had now organized for 15 years running, Charles danced with her 4 times, which was more than the 2 they had danced at the very first one, and more than the 3 they had danced at their wedding reception. And when she told him 4 was becoming conspicuous, he said he did not particularly care, and she did not argue with him. James, who was 14, danced once with Mary Crawford, the eldest Crawford boy's daughter, and spent the rest of the evening attempting to appear unaffected, which he did not entirely succeed at, And Cora watched this with the particular fond suffering of a parent watching their child do something they remember doing. Frances, who was 8, danced with Eli Watts's son Thomas, who was 7, with the complete seriousness of children who are doing something they have decided matters. And nobody made anything of it except Annie, who caught Cora's eye, and they both pressed their mouths together firmly. The social ended as all the Caldwell harvest socials ended, with Gus Hendricks packing up his fiddle, and the lanterns being taken down, and the long tables being folded, and the night air coming in with its particular October edge. Charles brought the wagon around and helped Cora up, and the children climbed in the back, and they drove home through the dark toward the lights of their house on the hill. James fell asleep in the wagon. Frances did not, because Frances rarely went to sleep easily, and she sat in the back watching the stars with her chin on the wagon's side, and announced to no one in particular that she intended to learn the fiddle. "Then you will learn it," Charles said. "Will you get me one?" "We will get you one," Cora said. When you are old enough to take care of it properly," Cora said. "I am already old enough." "You are 8. Gus Hendricks started at 7, Frances said with the particular confidence of a child who has researched her argument. "Gus Hendricks has been playing for 60 years, Cora said. "He is allowed to have started at 7, Frances considered this. "I will start at 8, she said. "That is almost 7. Charles made a sound in his chest that was not quite a laugh but was in the vicinity of one. Cora put her hand on his knee and felt him suppress it more completely. "We will talk about it," Cora told Frances. They got the fiddle in November. It was small because Frances was small, and it was not expensive because there was no point in expensive until you knew whether the talent matched the ambition. Frances approached it with the methodical intensity that characterized everything she decided was worth doing, which was to say she practiced with a thoroughness that produced in the early weeks a great deal of noise and gradually, over months, something that resembled music, and by the following spring something that actually was. In the spring of 1900, at the turn of the century that felt significant even in a small Kansas town, Charles and Cora Shelby sat at the edge of a world that was changing around them and was different from the one they had stepped into when they were young. The open range closing, the cattle drives done, the telegraph lines running everywhere, the railroad reaching further and further into what had been open land, and yet the basic facts of their lives, the farm, the children, each other, felt as permanent and as essential as the limestone bluffs to the north of town. Charles was 48, Cora was 44. James was 16 and already more man than boy, already making decisions about the farm that his father trusted, and already reading law books borrowed from the attorney in Wichita, because there was something in him that wanted to understand systems and how they worked, and what could be done when they failed. Frances was 10, and playing her fiddle well enough that old Gus Hendricks had declared she had real ability, which she received as confirmation of what she had already understood to be true. In the evenings of that spring, which was full of that particular quality of light that comes at the beginning of a new century, or at least at what people believe to be the beginning of a new century, Charles and Cora sat together on the porch or at the kitchen table or in the front room, and they talked or read or sat in comfortable silence. And the world outside continued to change, and they continued to be themselves, which was the particular achievement of two people who had found each other and built something real. One evening in April, Cora was writing at the kitchen table a letter to the county commissioner about the continued state of the school's roof, which had still not been properly repaired despite 15 years of requests, and Charles was reading, and it was quiet except for the scratch of her pen and the occasional sound of the animals outside, and he looked up from his book and watched her for a moment the way he always watched her, with that steady particular attention. "What are you thinking?" she asked without looking up, because she always knew when he was watching her. "I was thinking about the Dunn barn," he said. She set down her pen. "What about it?" "I was thinking about walking in and seeing you standing there in the doorway," he said, "in your blue dress, looking at me like you were not sure what to make of me. I knew exactly what to make of you, she said. I just did not know yet what you were going to do about it. And now you do. She looked at him across the kitchen table, across 17 years of shared life. And now I do. He set his book down and reached across the table, and she gave him her hand, and he held it the way he had always held it, with the steady warmth that was entirely him. And she looked at his face, the gray at his temples, the lines at his eyes, the mouth that had learned to smile more fully in the years they had been together. And she thought that no story about a harvest social and a woman who had not sent an invitation and a man who had come anyway ought to have turned out this well. And she was grateful every day that it had. I am glad I came that night, he said. I know you are, she said. I would do it again. I know that too, she said. You would do anything twice that was worth doing the first time. That is exactly who you are. He looked at her with that warmth in his face, complete and unhesitating, the look she had been collecting since they were new to each other and was still, 17 years later, the best thing she had ever been given. I love you, Cora, he said, as simply as he had said everything that mattered, as directly as he had said that first declaration over a recovered mare in the lamplight of a February morning years ago. I love you, she said back, as simply and as directly. I have from the beginning. I will at the end. Outside the kitchen window the April prairie was greening after winter, the grass coming back the way it always did, patient and persistent and impossible to keep down, and the sky was enormous above it in that particular Kansas way, and the two of them were at the table in the lamplight as they always were, and it was ordinary and it was complete, and it was the most that life could offer, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was everything. Frances could be heard upstairs playing her fiddle, a tune that was recognizably a tune now, and James's boots could be heard on the stairs, and the horses in the barn were quiet, and the night outside was full of spring cricket sound, and the lamp on the kitchen table burned steadily, and Cora Winslow Shelby sat with her husband's hand in hers, and thought that the women who said you should never stop sending invitations had never understood that sometimes what opens a door is the simple act of not knocking. And Charles Shelby, who had once spent 5 years saying no to everything the world offered him, and who had then saddled his horse on an October evening and ridden toward a barn he had not been invited to because something in him had finally understood that the only way forward was through, sat in his kitchen at the center of the life he had built, and thought that the best thing he had ever done, better than the farm and better than the fence lines and better than everything, was walk through that barn door and find her standing there. The fiddle played on upstairs. The lamp burned on. The prairie was vast and dark and full of stars. Everything was exactly as it should be.